Some debts are paid in gold, and others in blood. Foxfoot by Stanley Nesbitt. That brilliant orange fox pelt stood out, a brimming torch among the falling snow that blanketed her downturned snout. The crisp crunch of her heels against the untouched underbrush echoed through the valley, stirring any ear that was left to hear it in winter's deep. Though her hunger gnawed at her muscles, the fat it had once savored long since gone, she was not hunting. To hunt this time of year, as her mother had taught Foxfoot when she was young, would be a fool's errand. All that dwelled, hid, and all those that hid slumbered until they no longer could, or till the long night would take them. A leather belt found rest in her mouth, the thick bits worn down from the many seasons as she mulled it between her teeth. It did little to stop the pleading of her stomach, but it calmed her mind. Her father had taught her to keep the belts long, long enough to keep the stomach bound when hunger set in, and long enough to be chewed upon when needed. It was a bitter taste, for treating pelts into leather was no task for the light-stomached, and the months of sweat had found their way into the hide. Drawing back her pelt cowl, Foxfoot dipped her fingers into the edges of the creek. Greedily, she slurped at the clear current that burned her fingers with a chill. Drawing her hand across her face, she rubbed her chin dry as she looked between the cattails that clung to the water's edge. Unbinding the cording around her pack, she plucked the obsidian knife and set about hacking at the lowest ends of the stalks. Desperately, she gathered the first and then a dozen. With each one, she severed the head of the cattail in the thinnest stretch of the stalk before placing the head and bottom of each into her pack. Once Foxfoot had enough to fill the bottom, she scooped up a kettle's worth of water from the edge, careful not to get her mucklucks damp. They'd survive the cold and damp, but it always made the walk back miserable, and she always dreaded the walk back far more than getting to the creek. Tearing the needles from the pine trees until she had fashioned several bundles, which she hastily bound in grass cording. Though she trekked back, Foxfoot swayed east towards the birch trees that waited just beyond the ridge. With caution, she lowered herself down the steep hill and stuck to the trees that had clambered up the side. Foxfoot was devoted towards finding the birches whose bark had already healed from previous years, peeling only strips from the trunks before scraping the inside of the bark into a slightly smaller pouch until filled. Once content, she scrambled her way back to the top, only slipping a few times along the loose soil, which left her knees scraped, but nothing Foxfoot hadn't dealt with hundreds of times before. Her mother was too old to make this journey, and her father and brothers tended to the livestock and traps. She was the one who needed to make the journey. Scraped knees, damp mucklucks, and snow-heavy pelts were just part of it. As she reached the top, Foxfoot came to rest, her eyes keen upon the burrow that had been newly dug, nestled right beneath the soft, autumn-hued lip of the hill. Within it, something stirred. Hesitantly, Foxfoot clutched her knife as she leaned back, desperate to get a better look inside of the hole where something shimmered towards the back. She racked her mind with what it could be, for the chill was too strong for a snake to be stirring, and it glimmered too much for fur. But glimmer and stir it did, unaware of the girl who looked upon it with a cautious but kindled hunger. With a sigh, she plunged her arm deep into the hole until she felt it flail about. With a gut-wrenching squeal, it began kicking up the dirt and loose stone, squirming upon her blade as Foxfoot drove the blade deep. She could feel the resistance as it fought for its chance at escape, but with her weight, she bore down until the blade moved no further. Foxfoot could feel how it racked and clawed at her forearm, kicking at the palm of her hand as its pleas grew weak and its body still. When she felt the last of its trembling subside, she dragged it free and looked it over. It was a peculiar creature, with no fur, but its flesh, slick and shimmering, glowed in the afternoon light. Foxfoot looked over her arm, examining the claw marks and scrapes it had left upon her. Rolling it over, she could see where she stuck it, to the side of its breast, where blood had caked itself with dirt and roots between the folds. The wound was deep, and its thrashing about had worked the edge of her knife, cutting it wide. She left the kill on the burrow's edge as she scrubbed and cleaned at her gore-caked fingers with snow. Having worked a branch through the loose flesh beneath its jaw, Foxfoot staggered home, exhausted with her haul of food and water. Her family greeted her, all bearing cheers and smiles for her work, all but her grandmother, who stood silent as she eyed the kill. With a gentle hand placed upon Foxfoot's shoulder, her grandmother halted her. "Where did you find it?" she asked, turning her nose up at the creature. "Just above the birch bank," Foxfoot said, trying to find the reason for her grandmother's hesitation. She watched her grandmother turn and pull the door shut. "We'll eat good tonight." Grandmother let out a contented sigh and smiled softly at Foxfoot. "But it's not to be cooked upon the embers that warm one's home." Foxfoot nodded, handing the carcass over to her father, who gingerly took it. Excitement had already slathered itself over his face like war paint as the men giddily set about kicking aside the snow that clung to their fields. "Awful things," Grandmother said, chuckling to herself. "Stink worse than a man lost to the woods for a week when they grow." Foxfoot laughed meekly as she left her grandmother and helped them dig the pit to cook her kill. With the pit dug and the coals prepared, Foxfoot helped her father fillet and cut the meat. As the two reached deeper into the meat, they'd only had to throw out a few cuts until the crimson strands that wove itself throughout had become a web, rooted in the organs and sinew. Foxfoot tugged at the webbing and watched as the muscles and organs twitched in response, her father calling out to grandmother as he tore the kill from his daughter's hands. "Do not touch it, Foxfoot," he snapped. A hint of worry stained his tone. "Mother, what are these roots?" Foxfoot's grandmother didn't bother to even lean in, instead kicking the corpse into the pit where it fell upon the bare coals. They watched as the meat took to the flame, squirming as the webbing combusted and sparked. The stench stung their noses as they pulled the fur of their cloaks up and over their faces. "We will not step foot in among those birches again." "But we need the birch flower." "Not again," she barked, and Foxfoot could see the fear that fueled that anger burning deep in her eyes. "Not again," Foxfoot repeated, looking to the kill as it charred. "You two, to the creek with you," Grandmother ordered, working the toe of her muckluck into the snow, desperate to remove any traces of the corpse. "Bathe in the water, and straight home." Foxfoot and her father nodded reluctantly, watching as the last bits of the creature burned away.